I guess my question before we launch into that is, what is the debate? Because in one sense, what you've heard from the front this evening so far is a no-brainer. There's absolutely rafts of evidence, statistical and emotive, in favour of the value of landscape. But I think perhaps for me the central question is whether it's divisible at all, and whether it's wise to separate it out. So for me, that's probably the central debate that we do have time to really sort of thrash out. I've got one or two questions of my own, but I'd rather think of them as safety net if there aren't any from the floor. So I'm going to throw it immediately out to the floor. With a hand up, please, and if you take the microphone, just say who you are, please, before you ask your question.
Thanks. Neil Williamson, immediate past president of the Landscape Institute. Very interesting talks, lots of things I could comment on, but in order to sort of keep it succinct, if I just sort of pick out one particular question that comes to my mind, is I think there's an issue for me is how to get the message across to the politicians and the people who hold the purse strings about making the connection between the long term and the short term, because I think the problems that have been highlighted and very clear to me is that, you know, whether you call it value engineering or whatever, to me that's sort of short-term thinking in action. It's not seeing the long-term, not seeing the bigger picture, and it's just sort of what do we need to do in order to reduce costs for next week or next month. And what we're talking about, what we need to get others to understand, is the consequences for the next generation, the one after that, and the long-term future. So my thought is that the task in hand is to get politicians and others to actually genuinely understand the long-term consequences of decisions and translate that into short-term action. So that was my thought.
Thank you. We'll take two more and then bring the microphone to the front.
Noel Farrow, Farrow Huxley Associate Director, Chair of Policy as well. The first thing I want to say is, to quote back to Tom, it's not for us to believe that it's not for us to believe, but for those we convince to believe. I think that's absolutely right. I think we are just the best kept secret. Bottom line is, everyone in this room is completely convinced. That is completely pointless. I think it's very, very difficult it's not for us to be convinced, it's for the people that count, the people with the power, the people with the money that convince. I was at MIPIN 2 weeks ago. They've got the power, they've got the money, and they're not convinced. And I struggled very hard to convince. What the question I want to put to the panel is, you've absolutely given us a very good background as to why we are right and they out there are all wrong. But what I want to know is, well, how are we actually going to turn that corner? It is the eternal question. How do we get our message across? I have my own views on it, but I'd be interested to hear yours.
One more.
My name is Nicholas Falk from a company called URBED, Urban Economic Development. So I'm not a landscape architect, though I would describe myself as an urbanist and strategic planner. I wanted to ask the question of whether we're concerned about landscape or landscaping. I read through the excellent brochure, but it seemed to me that what they were giving, the brochure was giving, was examples of landscaping, and I can see how landscaping undoubtedly does add to the value of certain parts of a city, because it certainly improves the view. Trees add 21% according to Canada, water adds 18% according to research by British Waterways. But whether it really changes the whole nature of things, I'm not sure, whereas I think landscape perhaps does. And it seems to me that what matters is the continuous experience of moving through spaces of different kinds. And I would like to have heard a little bit more about that, which I think was hinted at in the Sheffield presentation. Having been involved in Sheffield, I felt the great transformation was when one went from individual projects, particular spaces, to that continuous experience of walking through a city which now feels manifestly different and perhaps more like a European city than an English one.
Okay. Perhaps Christine could lead off on the question of how to get the message across, and particularly the long term, and possibly Luke would add something on the long term thinking as well.
I think that's unkind. However, I'm not as convinced by the message as you lot. So in that sense, I'm probably not the right person for saying it. And I'm not convinced because I'm not convinced you're any more right about what the long term ought to look like than the rest of the population. And so I don't think that I'm very interested in something which says we've got to get the long term right unless you get the short term right. So I would still believe that the way that we work is incremental, and that you may very well and very properly have a longer term vision. It's going to have to adjust to many of the changes which you were suggesting, because we're clearly not taking those into account. But if you get a short term right, you've got a much better chance of getting a long term right.
Luke, do you want to?
Well, I think what I'd add to that is that if you don't get the long-term thinking right, the short-term may stop you from actually achieving the long-term. So the key for me is if you understand the system and what you're trying to achieve in the wider sense, and actually apply it more than just pretty gardens to walk through and on all of that, important as that is, actually I believe there's something much more fundamental about how do we survive in a very, very changing world. And I think that we need to allow enough space to actually put in those functions, allow them to happen. At the moment, those are being, in my experience, they're being squeezed out by the majority of clients. And I think that needs to be thought about. A very good example is Ashford, looking at how Ashford might expand over the next 30 years. The designs there looked at a certain number of square kilometres required to accommodate 32,000 new homes and associated roads and parks. What it did not look at was the amount of space that was required to support all of that in the immediate vicinity, which was another 24 square kilometres potentially of land. And I think those are the sorts of questions that we can actually help with, and we can back them up by actually having an idea about the big picture and then zooming in how that big picture can inform the short or medium term as well.
Richard, before you pass it along, I wonder if you can pick up two points. Noel's question about who we need to convince and how we convince them. But the reason I'm asking you to take it is Nick's suggestion of Sheffield actually hinting at something broader than the landscaping. I mean, I'd be interested in hearing your feeling about where your work has fitted into the total picture of Sheffield, because it seems to me that actually a lot more has been achieved in Sheffield than the public realm. You've concentrated this evening in your presentation on the public realm, but actually it's the success seems to me to be largely the product of the sum of all the parts actually working together. And perhaps you just add to a response on that question for Noel, who was actually already ahead of the game in Sheffield? How did it actually happen? Somebody must have already been convinced, because it wasn't just yourself. Someone authorised you and equipped you to deliver, as part of a multidisciplinary team, what has been delivered in Sheffield.
Right, there's quite a lot in there. Right. Well, who we've got to convince. I mean, the question that very much came into my mind as we were thinking about this question was the cost of doing nothing. I was thinking particularly in the way the economy of our country is structured, with a very overheated southeast and northern cities struggling to attract inward investment. We've all been quite shocked to see what's happened in the middle of Bradford as their regeneration project has ground to a halt. And we very much believe that the investment we made through a comprehensive master plan was critical in let's go back. The master plan had two aspects to it. There was a physical master plan which was paralleled by an economic master plan. So Tom is quite right. It wasn't just about public realm. Public realm was a key part of the infrastructure, but it bolted into something else. The economy, the physical master plan, how the two would play off each other and contribute to each other was very important. And I think this wider aspect of city confidence was really important for the city to actually help through this integrated master plan to rebuild a sense of civic pride and a sense of confidence that we can deal with the private sector, we can attract inward investment. And once it starts happening, there's then a snowballing process going on. I can't say too much because they're very sensitive in terms of the negotiation stages they're in, but there is more to come. And I'm absolutely convinced that taking that first step was critical. Now, the lead did come from the City Council. There was a very visionary head of environmental planning, a planner at the time called Narendra Bajaria, who had a great lot of courage, backed by political leadership at the time. And this was then closely followed by the Bob Kerslake era. So Bob Kerslake was absolutely critical in terms of strengthening that ongoing leadership and giving confidence to the private sector that the city meant business and would deliver. So, who has to be convinced? Well, we have to convince the private sector to come in on the back of the public sector investment, so they have to be convinced. And to be convinced, they have to see bold, confident interventions. The public realm was part of that. As I had people from Sheffield One, Creative Sheffield, who were the urban regeneration agency, saying to me they would meet inward investors at the railway station, and by the time they'd walk them up to the office in the city centre, the job was done. So they have to be convinced. Obviously, there were a lot of people to be convinced to achieve the public sector investment in the first place. A lot of the money came through the European Objective 1 programme. That was put together for the whole of South Yorkshire because of the very weak state of the economy.
Thank you, Richard. Paul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Very briefly, and then we'll take some more questions.
Well, very briefly on who do we need to convince? I think in this economic climate, we need to convince the clients. We need to convince the guys that have got the purse strings. And when, as I have, gone into major clients at an early stage in the design with a landscape practitioner, with the knowledge of how you can save money, I've never known them say, well, no, I don't want to do that. And when I said, I think you need to push yourselves up the food chain, I think that's where you need to help yourselves. By the Landscape Institute, these initiatives are brilliant in my view. I've only been involved with the Landscape Institute for a couple of years, but I've already seen a greater involvement with the clients. And as I said, these guys are in the business of saving money. So if you can actually be part of the team, rather than the main contractor or a larger consultancy firm, who are the only people that probably talk to the client, and you can get in there at an early stage, then you can help yourselves. And just one more thing about Sheffield, being a Sheffield lad, and the benefits that it is a much safer place to walk around, but there is an exception to the rule.